Greetings, everyone. I'm Shadow Watch. Thank you for tuning in. I hope this video helps you drift off to sleep. Before we continue, please like the video so I can keep creating more content like this.
They've been down there too long. I keep telling them they just need them to come upstairs, to leave that cramped, dark room of packed dirt and come into the light. We all need to leave this place while we still can. I'm still clinging to the hope that it's not already too late. Did you know that in Connecticut, sellers aren't required to disclose that a death occurred in a home unless you submit an inquiry in writing? I sure as hell wasn't aware. Not until after we'd already moved in, until it was already too late. I wonder if whoever buys this place after we're gone will think to ask. I did later learn that the realtor regretted selling to us. That if he had known our situation, he never would have shown us the place. I can't help but imagine what our lives would have been like if we'd never bought the small fixer-upper off of Lakeshore Drive. That's all moot now, of course. If it weren't for the price, we'd never have looked at it in the first place, especially since it had been a foreclosure. I hated the feeling of building our lives on the shattered remains of someone else's, but Gideon and I needed to move. We had to. We couldn't stay in our old house, its recently vacated bedroom dangerously close to becoming a shrine. We couldn't keep going to the same grocery store in our tiny town, where everyone knew and regarded us with looks of pity. Once we moved to Bridgeport, we were just 2 more people amongst 100,000. We could mourn in peace and anonymity, lost in the throngs. But living in the city doesn't come cheap. So, that's why Gideon and I were looking at a fixer-upper that had sat vacant before the bank eventually reclaimed it. I should have trusted my gut when I thought something about the place was off. The new cheery welcome mat seemed at odds with the rest of the house, which gave off an aura of a deep, almost crushing sadness. It hit me like a wave when we first walked in, a split second before the scent of rot and decay followed in its wake. The realtor apologized and said that they'd found fridges full of rotten food from when the prior owners left the place abandoned. He assured us that he'd dealt with something similar before, and with a few windows left open it'd air out in no time. The house was outdated in parts, yet remodeled beautifully in others. It seemed the prior owners had apparently begun the process of painstakingly restoring it before they abandoned the place, leaving behind a new kitchen, but upstairs bedrooms that were missing flooring and plastered with faded, mildewy wallpaper. As we approached the door to the basement, the smell intensified to eye-watering levels. There was something else that gave me pause, too. Something about the basement. The space was cramped, all unfinished dirt floor, and exposed brick beyond the small area that had been set up for a washer and dryer. Right at the edge of where the faint light from the single pull-string lamp faded was a small wooden ladder leading down into a darkness that soon swallowed it up. Despite the realtor's best attempts at leading us away from it, I found myself subconsciously drawn to it, unaware I'd even approached until I was standing at the edge. What's down there? I felt that wave of sorrow and longing the closer I got to the packed dirt floor leading down to the blackness. Nobody. For a brief moment, his salesman's smile slipped off of his face, and after an awkward silence he quickly added, just a crawl space. The smile was back. Just a little extra storage space. As my husband and I stared at the dark expanse beyond the ladder, we discussed plans to install some lighting to make that space, that took up the majority of the basement, usable. We planned a lot of things back then. We wanted to place Bree's belongings in one of the bedrooms like we had at our old home, even though part of us knew that their presence only served to highlight her absence. But the rooms upstairs were a mess, riddled with holes through the subfloors, mold behind the walls. So we reluctantly agreed we needed to complete the renovations before the space would be usable. It didn't feel right to put Bree's things in a storage unit during that time, though. Yes, I knew they were exactly that. Just things, just objects, but no matter how many times I told myself that, it felt like we'd be leaving her in a storage locker. So we wrapped up the rocking chair I'd read to her in cellophane, lovingly packed the stuffed animals and Barbies, and with the rest of the house being in the state that it was, we tucked them neatly into the only place safe from construction, the crawl space. Close by and protected while we made a safe, more permanent place for them. At first, I expected us to spend all of our free time down there, like we used to in her room at our old house. But something about that place alarmed me as much as it called to me. I think that even before we'd finished placing her belongings down there, we realized that we'd made a mistake. Some part of me knew. Maybe it was the look of that place, the black dirt that seemed to swallow up any light we directed at it from headlamps and flashlight beams, or the overpowering smell of lingering rot mixed with old earth. Maybe it was that feeling, the one of emptiness I'd felt when we first moved in, had been replaced by something far worse. As we placed the final box, the stale air down there was thick with a sinister sort of excitement. Even then, I had a vague feeling of no longer being alone. It didn't take long for the noises to start. I was running a load of laundry when I heard it over the rumble of the machine. A prolonged shriek, the sound of something sharp being slowly dragged across cellophane. It was my first time alone in the basement, and to hear that emerging from the claustrophobic space, at first I thought it was Gideon down there, opening the rocking chair, and I smiled sadly at the thought of him leaving work early, succumbing to the need to feel close to her again. I too had felt the burning desire to go down there, despite myself. Couldn't resist? I called down to the space. The sound abruptly stopped, and I heard shuffling along the hard dirt. I put a foot on the old wooden ladder, figured I'd join him so he wouldn't be alone. Felt right going down into the darkness. No one should have to be alone, especially in a place like that. That's when I heard footsteps from upstairs, followed by Gideon's voice, announcing his arrival home from work. I sprinted up the basement steps, out of breath and nearly tripping, as the only thing running through my mind was that if Gideon was upstairs, who the hell was in the crawl space? As I was about to describe what I'd heard to Gideon, I suddenly felt silly. I was in a new place, with our past wounds still so fresh. Of course, I was imagining things. The next morning, I was working from home when I heard it echo through the previously silent house. A giggle, a familiar-sounding one, coming from outside the kitchen window. I didn't remember leaving the window open, but when I went in to check, it was closed. Still, the laughter continued. That's when I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from below, floating up through the grate under the stove. It went on like that every so often. The sound of her soft laughter would float up from the basement. But there was a wrongness to it. It was laughter in name only, hollow and joyless, lacking the light my daughter had always carried. Gideon never mentioned hearing it, so I never brought it up. At the time I thought maybe I was just losing it due to stress, the stress of losing Bree, of starting over in a new city. Looking back now, and recalling the circles under my husband's eyes, the grimness there, he must have been in the same boat. The first time she spoke to me, I'd been bringing down a box of Christmas decorations. "Mom," I nearly choked on the air I'd been breathing. I never thought I'd hear Bree's voice again. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamt it. "Are you coming?" The voice, song-like, floated up from the dark. From the crawl space, a dry little cough echoed out. I lost my shit. I ran upstairs and I finally told Gideon. My husband gave me a look when I did, a look that said he understood. And if what I needed from him in that moment was to go into the basement and duck into that dark little crawl space so he could tell me everything was okay, then he was going to do it. The little room was pitch black as I followed him into it. All of our attempts to install lighting down there, temporary and otherwise, had failed. And the dim glow from the single bulb in the basement was swallowed up before even descending the ladder. We clicked on our flashlights. I wondered if he too had heard the sound of something moving across the packed dirt that echoed out seconds before we directed our beam towards the darkness. The sound of scurrying? Gideon gasped, and a moment later turned to reveal what he'd seen. A blanket has been placed across the hard dirt, one of Bree's, adorned with smiling characters from her favorite animated movie. Stuffed toys were strewn along it. A single book lay open off to the side. I didn't even need to see the impression left on the blanket to know that someone had been sleeping down there. Gideon shot me a questioning look. I didn't open the boxes, I whispered. He stared into the empty space for a long time before he nodded absent-mindedly. Insisted we leave the house, call the police to seek out whoever had been living in our home. It was a long night. We gave statements to one officer as the other searched the home. I don't know what was worse. When the first officer said there was no evidence anyone else had entered the house, or when the second officer stayed back to speak to me in hushed tones. "You've lost someone," I nodded in surprise, even though it was a statement and not a question. He leaned in. Whatever you think you hear down there, it isn't real. Nothing good could come from a place like that. You've been in the crawl space? I got called to do the wellness check on the Mikowskis, and he stared off into space for a long moment before he quickly shook his head, as if trying to escape from his own thoughts. Well, I found them. They were down there. The Mikowskis. It took me a moment to place the name as that of the prior owners. I'd seen the name on some mail we still received for them and brought back to the post office. What were they doing down there? I asked, even though the look on his face had me questioning if I truly wanted to know the answer. They weren't in a position to tell me. He stared past me, towards the house. There wasn't enough left of them. That night I couldn't sleep. I dreamt of the prior owners who never left this place. I dreamt of Bree. I dreamt of the crawl space. I awoke to the feeling of eyes on me. Gideon was sitting up in bed, giving me a concern-laden stare. We need to talk about last night. I don't think you should go into the basement by yourself. My response was silence, confusion. You don't remember what you said to me? He whispered, as if he thought someone else could be listening. I shook my head. That you wanted to go down there to be with her. That. He choked back a sob. You didn't want her to be alone in the dark. My horrified expression seemed to mirror his own. You know she's not down there, Nettie. She never was. I knew that, rationally I did. Then what is down there? I've never seen my husband look more afraid than when he softly said, I don't know. The longer I stayed away from the basement, the louder her laughter got, the more persistent the pleading whispers. When the hushed pleas turned to crying God, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go see her. Are you coming? The weak voice interjected between racked sobs. I found myself drawn to the sound, parental instincts still there, a mental phantom limb. I knew I made the right decision as I descended. Well, until I looked at her. Eyes glinted up at me from the well of blackness beyond, and the sobbing ceased instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. No, baby. My mouth was dry as the rational part of me desperately screamed at the rest of me, reminding me I was not talking to my daughter. I can't. I fumbled for my phone for the light, half expecting to see her staring up at me, big brown eyes wide, half afraid of what I'd see. As light flooded the room, I heard a soft movement, something wet sliding across the packed dirt of the ceiling. But I saw nothing. The little storage room was empty. As soon as the light went off, though, those eyes were back, regarding me from higher up along the wall, moving steadily downwards, never once blinking or darting away from my own. Please, her voice repeated. My stomach dropped as I felt a chill at my proximity to the thing mimicking my daughter's voice, something I'd apparently just caught in the act of crawling down the wall. I don't like the dark, she croaked out. That's what broke me. That's what led to my husband finding me broken down, bawling at the kitchen table. I begged him not to go back down, but he insisted. This was our home, he'd said. If we couldn't feel safe here, then where could we? So we went down into the basement, me with my phone light and him with the emergency flashlight. It was bold of me to assume that the situation couldn't possibly get worse. By the time I'd descended the little ladder, he'd already walked into the room. He had his back to me, standing in the shadows. Gideon, where's your flashlight? I turned it off. She doesn't look like I remember, he whispered. Annette, he added slowly, never turning to look at me, his broad frame blocking whatever he was seeing from my flashlight beam. Can you please go upstairs? Pack a bag for us? But now, please, he begged, his voice calm in tone, but shaky in delivery. He told me to leave without him if he didn't come back up within 10 minutes. To leave the house if he didn't come out of that basement, and to never come back, call movers to get our things. I nodded, numb. So I waited. I waited 10 minutes, 20, 30. After an hour had passed, I went down to the basement, and the ladder was gone. He must have pulled it down to keep me from coming after him. I felt a wave of unease, but infinitely worse, a sick pang of jealousy. Jealousy that he was down there and I wasn't. I whispered Gideon's name into the dark. Why haven't you left yet? His voice was weak, heavy with desperation. Babe, it's time to go. I replied as firmly as I could. We need to leave. All of us. Gideon's voice was choked, muffled. No, Nettie. It's too late for me. A day has passed since then. I'm still here. I can't force myself to leave. How do I get them to come out? I just want us to be a family again. This morning when I went down to check on them, the only response that emerged from the crawl space sounded like a low, wet gurgle. They've been silent ever since. I called the police, but they didn't seem to think that my husband and daughter refusing to leave the basement constituted an emergency. I know Gideon told me to leave, but I can't just leave my family, him and Bree, down there in the dark. I'm out of ideas. We need to be together, the three of us. Please help me. If I can't figure something out soon, if I still can't get them to come to me, well, there's only one option left. The scars have faded with the passage of years and clever plastic surgery. They've been smoothed, softened, hidden as best as medical science could manage. With proper makeup and the right lighting, you'd barely know they were there. A dab of foundation, a dusting of powder, and I look almost normal. But in the unforgiving, full, direct light of my bedroom, I can see them clearly. They stretch across my face and down my body, bumpy and crimson, like a grotesque roadmap of pain and survival. I run my fingers over the raised skin, tracing the memories that refuse to leave me. They're strange and jagged, reminders of something not quite real but all too vivid. They don't just look weird, they feel weird, a constant ghostly itch under the surface of my skin. I suppose I should consider myself lucky. I am the one who survived that horrific school fire. The miracle child, they called me, the sole student who made it out alive. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe the creature remembered that it was I, after all, who saved it from the nasty, muddy wetness that was dragging it down. Maybe it remembered how I'd kept it safe from a possible horrible death, stomped under the feet of some careless kid, and somehow engineered my escape. I don't know. Truthfully, I was unconscious from the smoke long before the fire was out. The doctors said that was part of why my lung damage is permanent, why I was like an 80-year-old smoker whenever I exert myself even a little. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you the story from the beginning, and you can decide what you believe. Maybe you'll think I'm crazy. Maybe you'll pity me. Maybe you'll think it was all a coincidence, a bizarre and tragic act of fate. I used to think about it all the time, replaying every moment over and over, searching for answers. It began on a gleaming wet fall morning, over 20 years ago, as I walked miserably to school. The world was washed clean from the heavy overnight rain, everything shining and sparkling with that deceptive beauty that sometimes follows a storm. The air was cold and crisp, biting at my skin, but the sun was warm when it peeked out from behind the clouds, casting golden light on the drenched landscape. I hated school. No, I loathed it. I don't have any reasonable explanation for why. I wasn't bullied. I had friends, people who would wait for me by the lockers or sit with me at lunch. My grades were fine, not stellar, not terrible, just average. But there was something about the building itself, the smell of stale cafeteria food mixed with cleaning chemicals, the droning hum of the fluorescent lights, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum floors that made my skin crawl. It felt wrong, suffocating, like a weight pressing down on me every time I walked through the doors. I couldn't explain the loathing that twisted in my gut each morning, so I never tried. Everyone else seemed cheerful enough that morning. The rain had turned the playground into a wonderland of puddles, and kids ran wild, shrieking and laughing as they jumped into the water, sending arcs of sparkling droplets into the air. I kept my head down, careful to avoid the puddles. My shoes were old and full of holes, and I didn't want to spend the whole day with wet socks. And that's when I saw it, half hidden in a pile of soggy, autumn-colored leaves. It was small, maybe the size of a pigeon, with scales that shimmered in the dappled sunlight like polished gemstones. Only its head poked out from the soggy mess, and its eyes, bright and blazing orange-red, locked onto mine. A damp puff of smoke hung around its delicate, dragon-like snout. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. It wasn't just the shock of seeing a tiny, impossible creature. It was the way it looked at me, as if it could see right through me, as if it knew all my secrets and fears. Instinctively, I knelt and scooped it up in my arms. Its body was warm, vibrating slightly with each shallow breath. Its wings flapped irritably, but it didn't struggle much. It seemed exhausted, waterlogged, and miserable. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and then I heard it speak. Not with a voice, but directly in my mind, clear as a bell. "I did not give you permission to pick me up." The words were sharp, crackling with irritation. I blinked, stunned, my grip tightening slightly. A group of younger kids rushed past, laughing and stomping noisily through the puddles, and the creature's eyes narrowed. It couldn't fly, not with its wings soaked and useless, and its fire seemed to have sputtered out as well. It was helpless. "Would you like me to put you back down on the pavement?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My mind was racing, struggling to comprehend what I was holding. A dragon? A myth come to life? It didn't make any sense. The creature glared at me, its orange eyes glowing like embers. "No," it said, the word echoing in my mind like a dull bell. It seemed to sigh, a shudder running through its small, scaled body. I could feel its exhaustion, its discomfort. I bit my lip. "Why don't you come home with me?" I suggested. "You can dry off, rest a bit. Once you're better, you can fly away. I'm not going to try and imprison you or anything." It eyed me suspiciously, and for a moment I thought it might refuse. Then it seemed to consider the offer. "And what do you want in return?" it asked, the question laced with suspicion. The words slipped out before I could stop them, like a long-buried wish surfacing unbidden. "Burn the school down," I said softly. "Please." It nodded solemnly, a regal gesture that felt almost absurd coming from something so small. I didn't think it would take me seriously. I didn't think it would remember. I didn't think any of this was real. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I tried to hide my nervousness. I ran home, my mind buzzing, and carefully laid the creature on my bed. It curled up in the tangled sheets, its scales still glistening wet, and closed its eyes. I left it there, whispering a quiet promise to keep it safe. It was so strange, so surreal, that I almost convinced myself it had been a daydream. But the next morning, the creature was still there. It looked miserable and sluggish, barely moving when I crept into my room. I thought it would be days before it recovered, and I left for school feeling guilty but relieved. Maybe it would just forget. How could I have known what was coming? The first sign was the fire alarm, a shrill, piercing wail that shattered the monotony of second period. We all looked up in confusion. Then came the acrid smell of smoke, followed by the sight of thick, roiling flames licking at the edges of the windows. The fire spread faster than I ever imagined fire could move, leaping from wall to wall, consuming everything in its path. The heat slammed into me, a wall of suffocating, blistering air that made my eyes water. I heard the crackle of burning wood, the sickening groan of the building starting to give way, and then the screams, panicked, desperate screams that made my blood run cold. The smoke was everywhere, thick and choking, and I could barely see. I stumbled, coughing, my lungs burning, and tried to find an exit. I didn't make it far. The world spun, the noise and heat crashing over me in waves, and I felt myself falling. The last thing I remembered was the feeling of something warm and familiar curling around me, shielding me from the worst of the flames. A soft voice whispering, "I didn't forget." When I woke up in the hospital, I was a different person. My face and body were a patchwork of burns, the pain so excruciating that I couldn't breathe. I had permanent lung damage, my voice hoarse and weak, my breath shallow and painful. They told me I was the only one who had survived, the miracle child pulled from the ashes. No one ever figured out how the fire started, though theories abounded. An electrical malfunction, a gas leak, a freak accident. But I knew the truth, even if no one would ever believe me. I still think about that creature, the way it had looked at me, the way it had kept its promise. I still wonder if it watches me sometimes, hidden in the shadows, waiting. The scars on my skin are a reminder of what happened, but the scars inside, those run even deeper. Some nights I dream of fire. I wake up coughing, my lungs aching, and I swear I can see a pair of orange-red eyes watching me from the darkness. A soft wisp of smoke curling around my ceiling, and I wonder if I will ever truly be free from the wish I made that day, or if some debts are never truly paid. I met Jeremy at the tail end of sophomore year, though he wouldn't have known it. Psychology major, sharp jaw, always carrying a battered, highlighted textbook under his arm. To him, I was just background, another half-smiling face in the mass of campus strangers. But I watched him. I was drawn to his confidence, the way he leaned forward when he talked, like he wanted to dissect people's words, peer inside their minds. And that casual smile, it was natural on him. He probably had no idea how that smile felt to people like me, people who lived on the edges, unseen. A glint of warmth on a cold day. For me, that smile was a flickering flame. The little occult shop in town was the type that pulled at you with its own quiet gravity. Its shelves sagged with oddities. Dried herbs, jars of something that looked like crystallized spiders, tarot cards with edges worn soft by years of handling. I'd been browsing in there since freshman year. Mostly I looked, rarely bought. The owner, an older woman with eyes that lingered too long, didn't care. That day, though, I found the book. A cracked, dust-coated, leather-bound thing stuffed under a stack of crumbling grimoires. Charms and potions to influence the heart. I nearly laughed at it, but I flipped through the pages, my fingers staining just from touching it. There, between brittle sheets and smeared ink, was the love potion spell. Irresistible allure, it claimed, with warnings written faintly in cursive in the margins. I shrugged them off. Desperation drives people to warnings, but what did they mean to someone who didn't plan on taking them seriously? Besides, I wasn't desperate. I was curious. The instructions were straightforward, even for a first-timer. A few herbs, some strange Latin incantation. Nothing I hadn't tried in simpler forms. But one detail felt unnecessary. The book advised a personal cleansing ritual before crafting the potion, to prevent the caster's own desires from tainting the charm. I scoffed at the idea. My desires weren't dangerous, maybe a little silly, maybe stupid, but not dangerous. So I skipped it, brushing it aside as some medieval quirk. Back in my apartment, the kitchen reeked of thyme, rosemary, and something called witch's lavender, a cloying scent somewhere between licorice and death. I ground the herbs in my mortar and pestle, feeling each hard crush of the stone, then mixed the powder with honey and a drop of my own blood. A required personal touch. The whole concoction gleamed dark red in the dim light, the color of a bruise. Thick, syrupy, almost alive in the jar. I held it to my nose, inhaling that odd mix of bitterness and sweetness, and felt a small thrill tighten in my chest. The next day, there was a campus event in the courtyard. Some tedious student fare with free coffee on a long table lined with dusty thermoses. Jeremy was there, chatting with friends near the theater club's booth, coffee cup cradled in his hands. Perfect. I slipped the vial out of my coat pocket, popping the cork as inconspicuously as I could. The potion trickled out in a thin stream, nearly black, sinking into the coffee like oil in water. I stirred it quickly with the plastic stir stick, looking around, heartbeat quickening, but no one was paying attention. Why would they? Then I watched him drink. Watched him talk with that effortless laugh and casual shrug. Watched the coffee cup go up to his mouth, the potion slipping past his lips. I had to pull my eyes away so no one noticed. And then I waited. It wasn't immediate, no magic spark, no grand revelation. But over the next few days, things shifted. I'd pass him in the library, and he'd do a double take, that small flash of recognition in his eyes, like he was recalling a dream. And then he'd smile, half confused, but a little longer than usual. Once, as he left the library, he turned back, lingering by the door as if he had something to say, his eyes finding mine through the glass. At first, the thrill of it made me dizzy. It was like touching fire without getting burned, like I'd somehow altered the air around me just by saying I would, by wanting it. The first time Jeremy showed up outside my class, I thought it was coincidence. Just him leaving the lecture hall next door. He walked up to me, an easy smile spreading across his face like I was someone he'd known all along. "Hey, Emma, right?" The sound of my name from his mouth was like an electric jolt. He said it like he'd practiced it, testing out the shape of each syllable. I managed to nod, feeling my cheeks heat up. "I thought I recognized you from the library." He laughed, an awkward chuckle, his hand rubbing the back of his neck. "You have this focused look, you know? Makes me wonder what you're always reading about." His gaze lingered a second too long. Yeah, I stammered. "I read a lot. For class and other things." There was a spark in his eyes as he asked what I was studying, what I liked to do, if I'd want to grab coffee sometime. He seemed genuinely interested, too interested, maybe, and I found myself overwhelmed, almost uncertain. But I agreed, because, after all, wasn't this what I'd wanted? Over the next few days, I started seeing him everywhere. He'd pop up when I was leaving the library or walking to class, or at the cafe where I went to unwind. He acted surprised each time, always chuckling like, "What are the odds?" It was thrilling that first week, like I'd somehow summoned him from a distance. But soon, his presence became a constant shadow I couldn't shake. One evening, I was sitting on my dorm's front steps, headphones in, hoping for a quiet moment to myself. Then a shadow loomed over me. I glanced up, startled, and there he was, standing inches away, grinning down at me. "You're hard to find, you know that?" he said, his eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. "I tried to catch you in the library today." I pulled out an earbud, forcing a laugh. Didn't realize I had a schedule to keep. He didn't laugh. He just kept watching, his gaze heavy. "Just saying it'd be nice if you made a little more time for me." A few days later, Lily started noticing too. She was my roommate, my one friend on campus who knew my quirks and obsessions, though she only teased me for them. But the morning she saw Jeremy waiting outside our building, she raised an eyebrow. "That guy again?" she asked, peeking through the blinds as he lingered by the entrance. "Is he always around? Or is it just me?" I tried to play it off. "We're just getting to know each other." She gave me a hard look. "Emma, getting to know each other is one thing. Having a guy stalk you is another." "He's not stalking me, Lily. He's into me, I guess." She shook her head, closing the blinds with a sigh. "Just be careful, okay? He seems a little intense. I brushed it off, but the word clung to me. That night, I felt my skin prickle as I realized how often his face flashed in my thoughts, how his gaze felt more like a lock than a look. The next evening, as I walked back from class, I felt a presence behind me. Quick, light footsteps, then a familiar voice. "Emma." I turned. Jeremy was standing just a step away, close enough that I felt his breath sharp and shallow. "Hi," I managed, forcing a smile. "Didn't realize you'd be here." He reached out, his hand brushing my arm, holding just long enough that I felt pinned in place. "You didn't text me back." I stammered, trying to explain about assignments, a long day, but he didn't let go. His grip tightened, his fingers pressing into my skin. "I just don't get it," he said, voice barely above a whisper, his face inches from mine. "I thought we were special." "Jeremy, you're hurting me," I said, tugging my arm free. For a second, a strange light flashed in his eyes, a brief, angry spark, but then he released me, his hand falling limp by his side. He muttered an apology, his eyes trailing me even as I hurried away. When I got home, Lily was already there, tapping away on her laptop. She looked up when I came in, her expression softening as she saw my flushed face and the red marks on my arm. "What happened?" "Nothing," I lied. "Just Jeremy." "Emma, this is getting weird. You need to tell him to back off." She bit her lip, worry creasing her forehead. "Or I will." I waved her off, embarrassed, but a part of me was relieved she noticed. Maybe I wasn't overreacting. Maybe he was going too far. But I'd tell him myself, I thought. I didn't want to make it worse. The next morning, I woke to a quiet apartment. Lily's bed was empty, her things untouched. I assumed she'd left early, maybe went to the library or for a run, though she was usually one to leave a note. I texted her once, twice. No response. By evening, worry settled heavy in my chest. I tried her phone again, hearing only the hollow rings on the other end. I called a few friends, checked the library, even the student center. No one had seen her all day. Then, around midnight, I heard a knock. Faint, almost hesitant. I opened the door, half hoping to see her there with some explanation. But it was Jeremy. His face was shadowed, his eyes rimmed with something dark, like he hadn't slept. "Hey, Emma. Been waiting to talk to you." His voice was calm, too calm, but something in his expression, too soft, too careful, made my stomach twist. I tried to shut the door, but he pushed against it, forcing his way in. "Where's Lily?" I blurted out, fear breaking through my voice. "Gone," he said simply, like it was an obvious fact, a truth as solid as the walls around us. She was in the way. A wave of nausea hit me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. Jeremy stepped closer, his face uncomfortably close, his breath hot against my cheek. "I don't want anyone else," he whispered. "Just you, Emma. Only you." I didn't know where else to go. After that night with Jeremy, his face too close, his words slipping over me like a dark fog, the only thought I had was get help. Professor Grayson had always been friendly, almost fatherly, with his students. He taught my introductory psych course last year, and I remembered the way he'd lean against the podium, speaking about human behavior with a steady, thoughtful tone that made complex topics seem less intimidating. I'd hoped he'd still have that tone when I told him about Jeremy. The next morning, I found him in his office, hunched over a stack of papers, reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. He looked up, surprised, when I knocked, but his expression softened as I stepped in. "Emma? Something on your mind?" His voice was gentle, a rare calm in the spinning chaos of my life right now. I sank into the chair across from him, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. I didn't know where to start, so I just started. I told him about Jeremy, how I'd felt a thrill when he'd first noticed me, how that thrill had quickly twisted into something else, something suffocating and terrifying. I told him about Lily, about how she'd disappeared, about Jeremy's last words to me. As I spoke, I could see Professor Grayson's expression harden, lines forming at the corners of his mouth. When I finished, he sat quietly, processing, before finally speaking. "Emma, this sounds like a situation you can't ignore." He took off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I know this is difficult, but I think you need to take this seriously. Have you gone to the police?" The word police hit me like a splash of cold water. I hadn't thought of it. Some part of me still wanted to handle it alone, to keep this hidden, as if speaking it aloud would make it real. "I don't know, Professor. He's just so good at talking his way out of things," I stammered. But as I heard myself, I realized how flimsy it sounded. How could I expect anyone to help me if I didn't even try? Grayson nodded slowly, leaning forward. "Emma, listen. There's a possibility here that his feelings for you have become obsessive, and that's something that needs professional attention. If he's as clever as you say, he may try to manipulate the situation. But you have to report it. Otherwise, you're the one without protection." I felt a prickle of fear and a desperate sort of relief. "Okay," I whispered, barely loud enough to hear. "I'll go." The police station was a maze of buzzing phones, murmured voices, and the soft shuffle of papers. I felt small in that space, as though every set of eyes knew my secrets, saw the tangle of regret and guilt I carried in my chest. After a short wait, an officer named Michaels led me into a room with pale walls and flickering lights. He was younger than I expected, with sandy blonde hair and a thin smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Miss Graves, you reported a concern about someone named Jeremy?" His voice was calm, patient, as he opened his notepad, ready to jot down what he probably thought was another college drama. "Yes," I said, steadying my voice. "Jeremy, he's been following me, showing up everywhere. He's been intense. And my roommate, she disappeared. The last time I saw her, she'd confronted him. He said she was in the way. Michael's pen scratched across the page, his face unreadable. Did you see him do anything directly to her? I hesitated, the words tangled in my throat. No, but I think he must have done something. She wouldn't just leave, not without telling me. He nodded slowly, watching me. Do you have any evidence, Miss Graves? Texts? Threats? Anything specific he's done that could back this up? No, I whispered, hating the smallness of my voice. But he's always there, everywhere I go, like he's watching me. And he told me I was the only one for him, that he didn't want anyone else around me. Michaels jotted down a few more notes, nodding in that patient, skeptical way that made my skin crawl. I could almost feel his judgment, the doubt coiling in the room between us. He promised to look into it, but the tight set of his mouth told me all I needed to know. To him, I was just a girl spinning a story, maybe jealous, maybe paranoid. My words felt flimsy, insubstantial as they floated away from me, and I knew they weren't enough to convince him. The call came a couple hours later. Officer Michaels. His tone was flatter than before, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. Miss Graves, he began, I wanted to follow up on your report. My partner and I spoke with Mr. Fields, and he had a lot to say about you. My grip on the phone tightened. A lot to say about me? Michaels continued. Mr. Fields indicated some concerns about your recent behavior. He said he felt you'd been following him, contacting him excessively, and Michaels cleared his throat, making unfounded accusations. I stood there, the silence pressing down around me like a shroud. That's not true, I managed, but my voice sounded thin, barely there. Miss Graves, Mr. Fields was remarkably cooperative. Michaels replied, the clipped edge to his voice as sharp as a knife. He's expressed that he's worried for your well-being. My head spun, worried for my well-being. I knew I shouldn't be surprised. Jeremy had the kind of charm that disarmed you before you even realized it was happening. But the words hit like stones. So you don't believe me? The question slipped out, edged with a desperation I hated hearing in my own voice. Michaels hesitated, then let out a slow sigh. We take all reports seriously, but Mr. Fields provided a different perspective. He even mentioned that he feels you may have projected certain feelings onto him, that maybe you felt hurt when he didn't reciprocate. His story was consistent. The words hit me with a nauseating clarity. Jeremy had spun it perfectly, turned me into the unhinged one. I know what I saw, Officer Michaels, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. He's been following me, showing up everywhere I go. And my roommate, Lily, Mr. Fields told us about your roommate, Michaels cut in. He said she left abruptly after a disagreement between the two of you, and there's no evidence to suggest anything otherwise. I felt my grip slipping, a cold panic crawling up my spine. But she wouldn't just leave. Not like that. She didn't tell me anything, and I haven't heard from her. Please, you have to understand. Miss Graves, we understand that you're upset, Michaels said, his voice softening slightly, like he was speaking to a child. But we can't pursue further action unless there's concrete evidence or a clear threat. Mr. Fields expressed genuine concern for you. He's offered to back away if that's what you need. I could almost hear the finality in his words, the practiced tone of dismissal. To them, this was resolved. My mind was made up, my side of the story a flimsy attempt to cover up jealousy or disappointment. I was losing ground, fast. Thank you for your time, Officer Michaels, I said, forcing the words out, feeling them slip away like lifelines into an abyss. Take care of yourself, Miss Graves, he replied. And then there was a click. The line went dead. The next morning, I went back to Professor Grayson's office. Not sure what I'd even say, but knowing I had to tell someone. He listened as I explained what had happened with the police, his expression darkening with each word. When I finished, he shook his head, a pained look crossing his face. I'm so sorry, Emma. I can't imagine how frustrating this must be. His voice was steady, calming, but his face betrayed his frustration. It's disturbing. The way he's manipulated this situation. What do I do now? The question fell out of me, half plea, half despair. Grayson leaned forward, his eyes earnest. You need to protect yourself, Emma. Be careful around him. Avoid any direct confrontation if possible. If there's any further escalation, the police will have to listen. They can't ignore you forever. The room felt suddenly colder, the quiet stretching thin between us. His words should have been reassuring, but they only deepened the gnawing fear inside me. Jeremy had already drawn a line around me, shutting out anyone who might have helped. And now, with the police doubting my every word, I felt as if that line was tightening, closing in. Emma, you did the right thing by going to them. Even if they don't see it now, you've planted the seed. If something else happens, they'll be watching him. I nodded, swallowing hard, but the cold dread gnawed at me. A thick stone lodged in my stomach. Jeremy wasn't just dangerous, he was cunning. And he knew how to twist things, bend reality until the truth no longer resembled itself. Grayson leaned forward, lowering his voice, his gaze locking on mine. Emma, stay vigilant, and don't let your guard down around him, not even for a moment. Do you understand? I nodded again, but my hands were still trembling. I could barely process his words, the gravity of it all settling like lead in my bones. This was beyond anything I could explain away. I had created something that now existed outside of me, something I couldn't control. When I left Grayson's office, my heart was heavy with a dread I couldn't shake. Each step I took felt weighed down, as though Jeremy's shadow had somehow rooted itself to me, stretching out of sight but never far behind. I sat in my dorm room, staring at the empty space where Lily's things used to be, feeling a hollow ache expand inside me. Jeremy had turned everything upside down with barely a handful of words. To the police, I was now the one in need of help. Jeremy was free, probably laughing to himself at how effortlessly he'd twisted the truth. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and rustle outside my window sent jolts of fear through me, visions of Jeremy lurking just beyond the glass. That calm, calculating look in his eyes. The walls seemed to close in around me, the silence thick and suffocating. I tried calling Lily's phone again, the line ringing and ringing until her voicemail kicked in, her cheerful voice echoing through the empty space. Hey, it's Lily. Leave a message, and I'll get back to you soon. I didn't leave a message. I knew I wouldn't get a call back. After my last meeting with Professor Grayson, I did my best to avoid Jeremy, ducking down side hallways, taking the long way home from class. But it was no use. He was always there, waiting with that quiet, intense stare that seemed to peel back layers I'd thought were hidden. One night, as I was leaving the library, he stepped out from the shadows, his gaze heavy, lips parted like he'd been waiting hours just to say something. Emma, he said, his voice soft, almost coaxing. You don't have to keep running from me. You know I'd never hurt you. The words echoed my own thoughts. Thoughts I'd whispered to myself late at night, trying to convince myself that he wasn't dangerous, that I hadn't brought this on. Please, just leave me alone, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But the fear in it was too real, and he must have heard it because he smiled, a slow, almost pitying smile. Emma, he whispered, taking a step closer, you know you can't hide from what you feel. I know you better than anyone else, better than you know yourself. The way he said it chilled me, as if he'd peeled that thought from somewhere deep inside my mind. How could he know those words, those exact words? I had never said them out loud. The thought scratched at my brain, a creeping paranoia sinking its claws into me. Over the next few days, I saw him everywhere. If I walked out of my dorm, he'd be standing across the quad, his eyes following me even from a distance. If I ducked into the cafeteria, he'd sit a few tables away, watching with an expression that was both knowing and hungry, like he was waiting for me to break down, to finally acknowledge him. I stopped eating in public, avoiding the places where he might show up. My nerves were fraying. I couldn't focus, couldn't sleep. His words, his gaze, each encounter chipped away at the edges of my thoughts until they didn't feel like my own anymore. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was inside my head, that somehow he knew my thoughts before I even did. One afternoon, as I crossed the courtyard, he appeared beside me out of nowhere, slipping into step as if he'd always been there. "You shouldn't ignore what's right in front of you, Emma," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "You know, pretending I don't exist won't make this go away." I flinched, tightening my grip on my bag, quickening my steps. But he matched me easily, a shadow tethered to my own. The campus felt empty, the late hour lending an eerie silence to everything around us. "Jeremy, I don't know what you think this is, but whatever it is, it's over," I said, trying to inject steel into my voice. "Is it?" he asked, sounding genuinely curious, as though I'd suggested something amusing, maybe even absurd. "You think walking a little faster will change anything? You think you can just wish me away, like some bad dream?" I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. "This isn't real. Whatever you think is between us, it's just a mistake, a misunderstanding." He laughed softly, a sound too close to my ear. "A misunderstanding?" His voice was calm, almost indulgent. "Emma, you made this. You made me. And now you want to pretend it didn't happen." I made him. I forced myself to look at him, summoning every ounce of courage left in me. "You don't know me, Jeremy. You've never known me." His expression shifted, a hint of something darker in his eyes as he leaned closer, his voice low. "I know you better than anyone. I know the parts of you no one else even sees." He cocked his head, his gaze fixed on mine. "Tell me, when's the last time anyone else paid attention to what you really wanted?" My stomach twisted. You're twisting this," I said, my voice wavering, but I held his gaze, refusing to back down. "Whatever you think you know, it's a lie. It's in your head. You can run," he said, a strange satisfaction in his voice, his eyes glinting. "But you'll always end up here. You know that, don't you? Back where it all began. With me." I felt my heart pounding, my legs aching to bolt, but his gaze held me in place. "No," I whispered, voice trembling. "I'm not coming back to you. I never chose this." He stepped closer, so close that I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. "But you did, Emma," he murmured, his voice soft, dangerous. "The minute you thought of me, the minute you wanted me." I swallowed hard, hating how my voice shook. "Wanting isn't the same as this. This is twisted, it's wrong. It's a violation." Jeremy's smile widened, a dark, almost pitying look in his eyes. "You can tell yourself that all you want. But you and I both know you've never wanted anything. Anyone. As much as this." His gaze pierced through me, his voice taking on a hint of mockery. "You can't run from what's already inside you." I could feel the ground slipping out from under me, my mind scrambling for an escape. But as he watched, that strange, knowing smile still on his face, I knew he'd already won this battle. That night, as I lay awake in my bed, I felt his words echoing through my head, dark tendrils wrapping tighter around my thoughts. I tried to shake them, to convince myself it was paranoia, but his voice was there, whispering my own fears back to me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The only place I knew to turn was that old shop, the strange, dusty room where I'd first found the spellbook. Desperation had pushed me to the edge. I needed answers. The shop looked the same as ever. The shopkeeper was there, standing by the counter with that same unreadable expression, as though she'd expected me all along. Her eyes narrowed when she saw me, a slight curve of amusement at the corners of her mouth. "Back so soon?" she asked. I forced myself to speak, swallowing back the unease that tightened my throat. "The spell I cast. The one for attraction." My voice sounded small, hesitant. "Something went wrong. He's acting like he knows things I haven't told him, like he's reading my mind." The shopkeeper tilted her head, studying me. "Did you follow the instructions exactly?" I hesitated, shame pooling in my gut. "Mostly," I muttered, "but I didn't think the precaution mattered that much." The shopkeeper's eyes darkened, and she let out a long, low sigh. "You thought the cleansing was unnecessary," she said, her voice more a statement than a question. Her gaze felt like it was burrowing into me, unearthing my mistake from where I'd buried it under excuses. It was just a small detail, I whispered, the words pathetic even to my own ears. Her mouth twitched with a bitter amusement. The cleansing was to protect you from yourself, to bind the spell to your intention alone. By skipping it, you left the connection open-ended, unguarded. A spell like that doesn't stop at attraction, dear. It digs deeper, attaching itself to every thought, every suppressed feeling. It binds your psyche to theirs, an open channel. My stomach dropped, nausea twisting through me. An open channel. Jeremy wasn't just watching me. He was reflecting back my own fears, insecurities, every dark thought I'd ever buried. I'd done this. I'd ripped open a door and given him free access to the deepest corners of my mind. I took a shaky breath, my voice barely a whisper. Is there a way to undo it? The shopkeeper's gaze softened, but there was no pity in her eyes. Once a bond is formed, it's not easily broken. Bonds built on the mind and heart are strong, sometimes irreversible. She leaned in closer, her voice low and steady. But be warned, severing such a bond is no small thing. Can leave both parties damaged. The weight of her words pressed down on me, the hopelessness settling in like a lead weight. There was no simple undoing, no easy fix. I had created something dark, something hungry, and now it was consuming me piece by piece. As I left the shop, her words echoed in my head, each one sinking deeper, heavier, irreversible. I'd taken a harmless crush and twisted it into something monstrous. And now I'd given Jeremy a foothold in my mind, and every step I took seemed to lead me further into his grasp. The next day, Jeremy was waiting outside my building, leaning against the stone wall with a calm, patient smile. His eyes met mine, and there was a strange light in them, something sharp, unhinged. He took a slow step toward me, his gaze never leaving mine. "You went to the shop," he murmured, his voice low, almost gentle. My blood ran cold. I hadn't told anyone, hadn't spoken it aloud. There was no way he could have known. "What are you?" He stepped closer, his voice soft and familiar, as though he was coaxing a confession out of me. "I know everything, Emma. I know what you think about at night, alone in your room. I know the secrets you keep from everyone else. I know because you let me in." Each word sent a chill through me, a horrifying confirmation that he was bound to me in ways I hadn't even realized. I felt stripped bare, exposed, every dark thought held up to the light. I tried to back away, but he caught my wrist, his grip gentle but unyielding, his eyes locking onto mine. "You and I," he whispered, his voice soft but laced with something cold, "we're the same. And no one can come between us, Emma. Not the police, not Grayson. Not even you." My throat tightened, and I felt the edge of panic rise within me, a flood of helplessness I couldn't shake. "Jeremy, this isn't what I wanted." He tilted his head, a glint of amusement in his eyes, as though my fear only fueled his certainty. "Isn't it? You wanted me, didn't you? You wanted someone to see you, to be part of you. And here I am." I felt sick, a wave of nausea washing over me as I realized the truth. This was what I'd done, what I'd made of him, of us. He was my reflection, twisted and broken, but undeniably mine. As I pulled my hand free, his smile widened, a slow, chilling curve of satisfaction. "Don't fight it, Emma," he said, his voice like a shadow crawling over me. "You're already too far in." I turned and fled, his laughter trailing behind me, echoing down the empty corridors. Each step pounded with the realization that this wasn't some nightmare I could wake up from. I had bound us together, and the more I tried to resist, the tighter his grip seemed to grow, a thread weaving itself through the fabric of my mind. And I knew, as his voice followed me into the silence, that there was no escape. Not from him and not from myself. I hadn't seen Professor Grayson since the night I'd gone to the occult shop, but his words had lingered, sharp reminders to stay vigilant, to protect myself. Jeremy's presence was pressing in, a shadow I couldn't shake. I knew Grayson was the only one who might understand, the only person I could trust with the truth. When I reached his office that evening, the lights were off, the door ajar. A chill ran down my spine. "Professor," I called softly, stepping inside. His desk was cluttered, books half open, a mug overturned. It looked wrong, like he'd left in a rush. I moved further into the office, the silence growing thicker. My gaze landed on a dark stain near the side of his desk, smeared across the floor. My stomach twisted as I took in the scene. His glasses broken, beside what could only be. A shadow loomed in the doorway, and I whipped around, heart hammering. Jeremy stood there, his gaze locked onto mine, a quiet intensity in his eyes. I stumbled back, bile rising as I realized he was blocking my only way out. "Looking for Grayson?" His voice was soft, almost tender. "I told you, Emma, no one else matters. No one but us." Fear pulsed through me. I shoved past him, darting into the hall, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Behind me, I heard his calm, measured footsteps. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew he'd catch me. Bursting out of the building, I ran toward the forest, the darkness closing in around me as I pushed through the thick underbrush. Jeremy's footsteps grew louder, relentless. I could barely breathe, but I pressed on, desperation forcing me deeper into the trees. The only thought anchoring me was escape, the fleeting hope that somehow I'd lose him in the shadows. But his voice drifted through the trees, closer than it should have been. "Emma," he called softly, as if coaxing me back. "You can't run from this. You know that." But I kept running, his voice a dark promise, echoing in the cold night air. I stopped in a small clearing, the cold pressing in from all sides. Setting down the supplies, I knelt and arranged the candles in a circle, my hands shaking as I lit each one. The spellbook lay open before me, the words heavy on the page, almost pulsing with dark intent. This was the severance ritual, the one the shopkeeper had warned me about. With Grayson gone, this was all I had left, my last desperate attempt to break the bond I'd unwittingly unleashed. I had no choice. Jeremy had taken everything. My safety, my thoughts, even my sense of self. Tonight, it would end or it would consume me whole. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and began the incantation. The ancient words felt foreign and thick on my tongue, a strain as I forced them out. The candles flickered, and a cold wind swept through the clearing, wrapping around me like an unwelcome shadow. I could feel the bond resisting, trembling, refusing to break. A prickle ran up my spine, the eerie feeling of being watched. I opened my eyes, and Jeremy stood there at the edge of the clearing, his face cast in the eerie light of the flames. He looked at me with an unsettling mix of sorrow and anger, eyes glinting with something wild. "Why are you doing this, Emma?" His voice was soft, almost tender. My heart raced, but I stood up, clutching the book to my chest. "This has to end, Jeremy. You have to let me go." He stepped forward, his gaze intense, unwavering. "We're meant to be together, Emma. I know every part of you, remember? There's no escaping this." "No, Jeremy," I said, forcing strength into my voice. "This isn't love. This is wrong. Twisted. I never wanted this." His expression hardened, a flash of hurt giving way to fury. "You made me like this," he said, his voice breaking. "You bound me to you, and now you're trying to cut me away like I'm nothing." He took another step, then lunged, grabbing my wrist. "Stop!" I cried, yanking my arm back, but his grip only tightened. He pulled me closer, his face inches from mine, eyes wide and unhinged. "I won't let you take this from me, you ungrateful bitch," he snarled, his voice raw with desperation. "You're mine, Emma. We're bound together. You think you can just toss me aside?" His fingers bruised into my skin, and I fought back, wrenching my arm free, shoving him hard. He stumbled back, but his eyes were on fire with rage, his breathing ragged. In the chaos, I raised my voice, speaking the final words of the incantation with every ounce of strength I had left, pushing at the bond, ripping it apart. A fierce wind tore through the clearing, scattering the candles as Jeremy clutched his head, a scream ripping from his throat. I felt the connection unraveling, the poisoned thread between us snapping one painful fiber at a time. Emma, his voice broke, his face twisted in pain, lost. And then, like a light extinguished, his eyes dulled, his grip slackened, and he slumped forward, his expression hollow, empty. I staggered back, watching him, the weight of what I'd done sinking in with chilling finality. Jeremy was gone, his mind shattered, a hollow shell left in his place. "Jeremy," I whispered, but there was no recognition in his eyes, no spark, just silence. I backed away, nausea twisting in my gut as I stumbled from the clearing, fleeing into the darkness. The bond was broken, but it had left a scar, an indelible mark of the cost I could never undo. The days blurred together after that night in the forest. Word spread quickly. Jeremy had been found wandering aimlessly near campus, vacant-eyed and unresponsive, as though he were caught somewhere between dreams and reality. The authorities, confused but sympathetic, labeled him catatonic and transferred him to a psychiatric facility out of town. I never visited. I couldn't bring myself to see him again. Not like that. Friends of his, those who only knew him as the smart, driven student he'd once been, tried to reach out, but he barely responded. Occasionally, he would murmur something low and indistinct, a name he'd repeat under his breath. My name. The nurses told me this one day, almost as if they thought I'd be comforted, but it only deepened the hollow ache within me. He was there because of me, because I dragged him into something I couldn't control, something I never should have touched. One night, I took everything, the spellbook, herbs, candles, and vials, to the edge of town. Beneath a twisted tree, I dug a shallow pit, threw in the items, and struck a match. The fire crackled and grew, devouring each piece, and I felt a strange calm, as though I could burn away the past. But as the flames died, a chill crept over me. In a shard of glass, I glimpsed my reflection, his shadow faintly behind me, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. Yet, the weight lingered, an indelible mark, as if he would always be there, woven into my reflection, beyond my reach.